Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus. Dear Sarah and all your listeners, my name is Jolene and my Bigfoot encounter happened in the spring of 2009. I would like to start by saying that I never ever believed in Bigfoot or the hairy man or Sasquatch, and I would certainly never in my wildest dreams would have imagined that I would get to meet a creature that stepped out of cryptid zoology. I really thought stuff like that was delusional and all made up. I was to find out how wrong I was. At the time of my encounter, I lived in a beachfront home in Oregon, which is strategically located on a high elevated bank overlooking breathtaking whitewater views of the ocean and bay. Our Cape Cod style home is situated on half an acre of land that is lushly landscaped with a beautiful terrace and yard with ubiquitous trees dotted haphazardly all over the place, giving the property a really authentic, natural feel about it. I was 18 years old at the time and really took living in this idyllic location for granted because I got used to the taste of the fresh, salty sea air on my tongue and the panoramic, spectacular views that I would see every day. That all changed when my 22-year-old cousin Sophie came to stay at our home for a couple of weeks. Sophie came from New York and was well used to the life of a city slicker, so coming to a coastal retreat like our home was her idea of absolute paradise. When I showed Sophie around our home, all she could do was stare out at the ocean views in awe. I could tell she was so absorbed by the stunning vegetation, the long stretches of soft white beach sand that were literally yards away from our home. However, what I believed enamored Sophie the most was the sparkling views over the ocean underneath a pristine blue sky and the soft crashing sounds of the waves as they rolled rhythmically towards the shore. You do not know how lucky you are to wake up to this sensational view every day, she said. What I would give to live in a place like this. Do you know how lucky you really are? Sophie bubbled over with enthusiasm like an excitable puppy, and her rapturous delight over my amazing life was extremely infectious. Oh, she gushed, there is so much I want to do here. We must get up at the crack of dawn, just when the sun rises, and go for a long walk on the beach. When she said that, my heart sank. I began to feel a bit like the big fat elderly dog that lay in the corner sleeping all day, while Sophie was the excitable, enthusiastic puppy that wanted to experience absolutely everything that life had to offer her. I was beginning to think my cousin could become rather a handful for me on her holiday. I loved nothing better than to sleep in late until half the morning had already gone, but I could see Sophie would be pouncing on me early in the morning to go exploring, and that idea did not appeal to me. My family were delighted to see Sophie, and that night we all took her out to our favourite seafood restaurant, where we indulged in some of the local specialities which Sophie loved. "The best seafood I've ever tasted," she said. "It doesn't even taste fishy." My father laughed. "If your fish tastes fishy," he said, "then it's not fresh." "I did not know that," she said. "Is that true?" "It most certainly is," said my father. It was 4:30 in the morning, and I found myself being shaken by Sophie, who was eager to get me up as quickly as possible. I felt very annoyed. What time was this, I thought? Was my cousin completely bonkers? Was she stark raving mad? I closed my eyes very tightly and pretended to be fast asleep, and I even made a few snoring sounds to try and convince her that it was impossible to wake me up. Sophie did not give up. She was relentless. She shook me even more vigorously and pinched my arm so tightly that I let out a huge squeal. "Ouch!" "Wake up," said Sophie. "You'd be useless in New York. You are such a slouch." Now I was annoyed. "Sophie," I said, looking at my cell, "what time is this? It's still dark outside. Are you completely off your rocker?" "I want to go down to the beach and watch the sunrise," she said. "You have the ocean every single day, but I don't. I just want to enjoy every minute while I'm here, and I want to share it with you. One day you'll thank me for it," she promised. "When will that be?" I asked sarcastically. "When you're old and grey, and maybe you're frail, and you'll look back on your life and say, 'Thank goodness I experienced those sunrises with Sophie. Now I can revisit that memory.'" "All right," I said begrudgingly. "I'm coming, but do not make a sound because my parents are fast asleep, and the last thing you want to do is wake up my grumpy father." I reluctantly got dressed and followed Sophie down the wooden steps of the large wooden deck that surrounded our home, that offered sensational all-round views of the magnificent ocean. This deck of ours was a favourite spot for my parents to entertain on, and we had enjoyed wonderful summers out here barbecuing meat over an open grill, all the while truly being able to appreciate the glorious views and the sound of the ocean waves, not to mention the amazing bird calls from the gulls gliding over the water with their long white wings. It was quite a breezy morning as we ventured out onto the beach. The white sand was cool on our bare feet. It was low tide, and so the sea had retreated further away from the beach, and we found ourselves walking on the wet, firm sand. It was still dark outside, but the outside lights from my house, including my torchlight, offered as much light as we needed. "In the olden days," said Sophie, "this was the time when smugglers would operate the deliveries of their stealth cargo from the sea to land. It must have been quite exciting operating all those secret missions under the guise of darkness. Just imagine." "Sophie," I laughed, you do think about crazy things." Suddenly Sophie ran towards some footprints in the sand. I was stunned. Who was up and about so early, I wondered, as I observed the long trail of footprints that were clearly visible all down the beach. The footprints were absolutely enormous, and when I say enormous, I'm not exaggerating. I mean enormous. I would say they were 18 inches, and the person, like us, was clearly walking around barefoot, and only the angle of the toe on the foot looked strange. Otherwise, the feet were like ours, but much, much bigger. "Look at these footprints," gushed Sophie with excitement, "and look at the strides. They're huge. I kid you not when I say the person who has walked down the beach with these enormous feet must have been taking strides about 4.5 of our feet. You know how big you'd have to do that?" Sophie and I looked at each other in horror. Who could this be, we wondered? Who has feet this big? "Bigfoot," laughed Sophie. "It's got to be a Bigfoot." "Sophie, you get crazier by the minute," I laughed. "Bigfoot does not exist. It's like that Loch Ness monster stuff in Ireland. In Scotland. It's a myth and a legend." "I'm not sure that your dad would agree about that." "What are you talking about, Sophie?" I asked, looking bemused. "Why don't you ask him?" said Sophie. "Let's just say your dad and my dad had an encounter with a Bigfoot once, but he never talks about it." Why not? I asked, feeling irritated that Sophie knew something that I didn't. Because of people like you that think Bigfoot is just a huge hoax. I never said that I was not open to having my mind changed, I argued. Well then, said Sophie excitedly, let's follow the footprints and see where they go. I grew hesitant. If Bigfoot is real, I said, what if he's dangerous? Don't be silly, laughed Sophie. We're not going to go up to him and say, hello there, Mr. Bigfoot. Hi, my name is Sandra. How do you do? Of course not. We will follow the steps and hide away so that he does not see us. But we want to see him. You know how many people would die to be in our shoes right now? I was not convinced anyone wanted to be in my shoes now, and I, for one, didn't want to be in them either. The idea of following these footprints gave me a huge sense of foreboding. I had never believed in Bigfoot before, but the idea of pursuing such a potentially unpredictable creature gave me the chills. If my father had seen a Bigfoot, then there had to be real. But why would he have not told me about his encounter? I wondered, why was there all this secrecy? I finally agreed with Sophie about following the fresh footprints in the sand, and that is what we did, and they seemed to just go on forever and ever, until finally they just seemed to stop, in the middle of nowhere. Just like that. It was extremely weird. Unless, of course, I said, pointing to the rocky outcrop, he leapt onto those rocks and walked along there. That seemed like the only reasonable explanation for the end of the footprints. We had walked quite a way. Let's turn around and go home, I said. I really think pursuing this Bigfoot fellow is a little over the top, don't you? Suddenly, we heard whistling. Did you hear that? Gasped Sophie, looking exciting. It has to be looking excited. It's got to be Bigfoot, and he's coming this way. Quickly, run, hide, do something. He's coming. In that moment of mayhem and panic, we lost control of all our senses and just flattened our bodies onto the ground behind a large 5-foot rock, hoping with all our hearts that this creature would not see us. I want to say that chasing after a Bigfoot is exciting until suddenly you are facing a potentially real-life encounter. Then the excitement does wear off. That is when fear can take on a new level. It was a huge turnaround for me. I had never believed in Bigfoot, and now I was feeling a senseless feeling of overwhelming anguish. We could hear the footprints slapping against the rocky stones, and the creature continued to whistle happily to himself. I kid you not, the creature sat on the flat stone slab only yards away from us. It was the most thrilling and terrifying moment of my life at the same time. We peered over the top of the rock we were hiding behind and saw the creature squatting on 2 legs, looking up at the sky and whistling to himself. The creature was watching the sun rise and appreciating the beauty of it all. He continued to whistle, and then we saw him smashing something with a stone. It was a large crab, which he broke into pieces and sucked out its contents. The creature, squatting on all 4s, looked enormously big. From the back view, he was covered with fine hair. Even from the back, I could tell he was not a bear, because his hair was not as thick or dense as a bear's, and it was a sandy colour. I could also see those long arms and big hands. You could tell those arms were much longer than a human's arms would be. Finally, after finishing his little snack, the creature grunted with pleasure, like the satisfied sound you might make after indulging in a yummy meal. It was a sound of sheer contentment. The creature then stretched out his long body on the rocky outcrop and fell into a deep sleep. We could hear his heavy breathing and a snoring sound that sounded like irregular snorts. It was a funny sound, and even I found it hard not to burst out laughing. Sophie started to giggle, and I reached out and slapped her. "Shh," I whispered. "What if he wakes up?" The creature curled into a fetal position and turned around to face us, with his eyes closed. The creature was in a deep sleep, and so quickly too, I thought. Boy, I wish I could get to sleep that fast. This was the moment I will never forget. Close up and personal to a creature that did not exist, according to the know-alls in our society, myself included. Now I was starting to doubt. Now I was staring at it without a doubt, and it was a revelation to me. Bigfoot was definitely real. The creature I was peeking at over the rock had a curved A-shaped head with a hairless, weathered face and deep furrows or ridges in the brow area. He had a tiny whiskey beard on his chin and a mole-like spot on his face. Just as I was peeking over at the Bigfoot, I noticed his nose twitched, as if he was smelling something. And then, with that, he suddenly opened his eyes, and he was looking down on my eyes that had been peering up at him. He rubbed his eyes for a moment, because I imagine he wasn't expecting to wake up with two human pairs of eyes staring down at him. I truly think he was surprised and shocked to see us, and I really did not know how to react. But neither did he, because we really thought the Bigfoot was out for the count. He was clearly a deep sleeper, but a light one too. The Bigfoot was not aggressive at all. Surprised, yes. Angry or hostile, no. He also was not afraid of us at all, but he did not waste any time on jumping up from his sleeping position onto his legs. Standing up, he was at least 6 foot tall and 4 feet wide. He had large shoulders, big biceps, and virtually no neck. He glanced over at us one more time with his curious, inquisitive brown eyes. I did feel those eyes were expressing an interest in us, but he was not comfortable in hanging around humans, that was for sure. We watched the creature walking away and turning around one more time, and then he was gone down the end of the beach until he became a black dot in the distance. For a good 10 to 20 minutes, even Sophie just stood there staring in silent awe at this marvelous, wonderful, but formidable creature. Finally, I was the one to break the long silence. Did we really see that, I asked? Or am I about to wake up from an incredible dream, only to discover that my cousin did not wake me up at the crack of dawn, and I did not just see Bigfoot? It was a Bigfoot, said Sophie. Was he not the most beautiful thing you have ever seen in your entire life? She gushed enthusiastically. I would not describe him as beautiful, I laughed. I would say that he was the most intriguing and fascinating creature that I have ever seen, but beautiful, I think not. A little pongy too, laughed Sophie. He smelt like wet dog and cheesy sneakers. When we returned home, my mother was surprised to see us. I thought you girls were fast asleep, she said. Come and sit down. I'm making blueberry pancakes with maple syrup. I hope you like that, she asked. Oh, I love that. We sat at the table eagerly and wolfed down the pancakes hungrily. My mother looked at us in astonishment. Anyone would think you had not eaten for a month, she laughed. That sea air has really revved up your appetites. I needed the sugar badly, laughed Sophie, after what we saw. What did you see? Asked my mother, smiling. A Bigfoot, said Sophie. We saw Bigfoot. At that moment, my father entered the room, and as he heard Sophie saying Bigfoot, I saw my father growing as white as a sheet, as if he'd just seen a ghost. My mother roared with laughter. Did you hear that, Niall? She hooted. They saw a Bigfoot. They saw a Bigfoot. My mother's laughter revealed that she thought we were joking. She was so dismissive about what we had told her, and not for a moment did she believe it. You saw a Bigfoot. She laughed. My father was not so amused. You said you saw a Bigfoot, said my father, growing alarmed. Whereabouts? He asked. Oh, he was on the beach, laughed Sophie. We followed him. He was a real cutie pie, wasn't he, Sandy? I looked at my father's face. He looked as if he was about to explode. Do not joke about stuff like this, he said angrily. Those things are highly volatile, unpredictable, and extremely dangerous. Oh, please, Niles, laughed my mother. You sound as if you sound like a know-all. You sound almost as if you believe that Bigfoot's real. They're just winding you up, Niles, that's all. He has seen one, said Sophie with her mouth full of pancake. She pointed her fork at my dad. Tell them about your Bigfoot encounter you had with my dad. My dad looked at Sophie in horror. "My brother told you about that?" "No, he just said that you both saw Bigfoot once and it was terrifying. That's all he told me." "Well, he was lying to you," said my dad adamantly. And with that he darted out of the door, and I followed him like a devoted little puppy dog. He had entered the bedroom and was rapidly dialing his cell phone and pacing up and down the bedroom with a look of extreme anguish on his face. I stood by the wall and listened with my ears flattened against the wall. Why was Dad in such a state about this Bigfoot? I had never seen him behave in such a peculiar, standoffish way, and he had been so defensive towards Sophie, calling his own brother a liar. What was he in such a state about, I wondered. "So your daughter knows about our Bigfoot encounter," said my father on the phone. "Did I not tell you to never ever tell anyone about it? You betrayed me," he continued. "Well, even if you did not tell her about our Bigfoot experience, you told her enough, and she's asking all these questions and making stories about seeing a Bigfoot on the beach." "You bet it freaked me out," he said. "I told her you were lying, and you must tell her that it was all a wind-up and that you were just teasing her." "We can never tell anyone about this, understand," said my father, and at that he put down the receiver, looking extremely angry. I never got to hear what happened to my father with his brother, but I gathered enough information to know that my father had had a very traumatic Bigfoot experience, one that he would never ever reveal. Even a mention of the hairy man brought him out into a cold sweat. Sophie got a phone call from her dad telling her that he had lied about his Bigfoot encounter just to wind her up and tease her. But Sophie knew he was doing that to humour my dad. We both knew that. We decided to tell my dad that we had lied about the Bigfoot we had seen on the beach. I could see the huge relief wash over his face, and he said something like, "If Bigfoots were real, they sure would not hang around a sandy beach or an area like this." I do not know why my dad has sworn his brother to such secrecy about a Bigfoot encounter. Maybe he's afraid of the doubters and the skeptics. In truth, I am too, because one day I told a friend about my experience, and she keeled over with laughter and told me that I was a brilliant comic. So there you are. I'm not going to tell anyone about my encounter, and neither is Sophie. But why not in an anonymous letter? So whether you believe my account or not, that is my story. Sophie was right. When I'm old and grey, I will be grateful for my Bigfoot experience. And yes, he's as real as you and I. I hope you enjoyed my story. I just want to say that that was a really, really stunning story. And it does just prove how uncomfortable people are about talking about their Bigfoot encounters. And if you're one of those people out there, don't be afraid to get in touch and tell us your story, because your secret is safe with us. It's not going to be shared with anybody else, and you will remain anonymous. Dear Sarah, my name is Andre, and I'm a retired police officer from Washington State and have worked for the police force for many, many years. And I believe I have had some hair-raising experiences as a police officer that defy natural explanation. My Bigfoot encounter happened to me about 31 years ago, and is an encounter that horrifies me to this very day. It is hard to imagine that what I experienced was real at all. When I see the events that transpired that dreadful night, it is almost as if I am watching a horrific movie. It is almost as if the person playing my role is detached from me, rather like I'm watching myself from outside of my body, if you know what I mean. I truly think this is my emotional way of dealing with the horrendous, chaotic emotions that occurred to me that fateful night, that completely transformed and altered my perception of our reality and the physical world in which we reside. I would like to say that 31 years ago, I had never heard of Bigfoot or Sasquatch or the hairy man. The very notion of this creature wandering around the forests of North America was something that I was clueless about. I had always been a huge skeptic all my life, so if you had told me that you'd encountered a creature such as this, that really belongs in some horror movie, I would almost certainly believe that he was smoking something. I remember the night of my encounter as vividly today as I did all those years ago. It all started when I got a phone call from a lady who told me that her husband had gone in the woods to stake the area for a hunt that he and his friend Michael were planning to go on the following week. He was looking for all the telltale signs of deer droppings and animal markings that invariably would tell him a good place for them to erect a makeshift deer stand for the purposes of a hunt. She told me that her husband had left her house at 3 p.m. that afternoon, and it was now 8:30 at night, and he hadn't yet returned. I did not sound the alarm sooner, she told me, because I thought he may have gone off and had drinks with one of his friends. I'm used to him doing that a lot, you see. My husband is extremely social and outgoing, and it doesn't take much to persuade him to join you for a drink. When he did not return home, she continued, I felt that something was very wrong in my gut, and so I phoned up everyone that he socializes with, and no one had seen sight or sound of him. The woman was clearly distraught and sobbing over the phone. She told me that she rarely believed something quite terrible had happened to her husband. She felt it in her gut, and she just knew it. Well, that's what she told me. I assured the woman that she should calm down because there were more likely plausible explanations for his disappearance. I had seen it numerous times before when someone was reported missing at the station. More often than not, it was usually some level of miscommunication that had occurred, and invariably the missing person was usually found safe and sound a little later. I was also certain this was the case in this situation, but I knew that I needed to humour the woman by doing a search of the forest and going through all the right police protocols as an officer. The navy blue door of the contemporary modern-style home was opened by a woman of about 30 years old. I could see the area around her eyes was bright pink and puffy, which told me that she'd been crying a lot, and I did feel terribly sorry for her. I'm glad you're here, officer, she said. Just call me Ralph, I said. Oh, well, I'm Lisa, said the woman, shaking my hand warmly. I'm very concerned, officer, she said. This is not like Simon at all, to be out so long without even calling me. Well, I said, I'll go and investigate the woods. Where did you say they were? She gave me details of the location, and I drove to the area in question and parked my car in the clearing outside the forest that I could see stretched out for miles and miles. It was growing dark, and I only had my torch for light, so this mission was not as easy as I had imagined. I wondered whether I should call for backup, but I still adamantly believed that the husband would turn up eventually, and it really wasn't worth phoning the other officers on duty. I decided I'd just phone my partner, Mark, up because I knew it would be an arduous mission going through this forest without a little bit more help, and besides we could well do with some extra lighting because the woods were ominously dark. When Mark arrived, I did feel a sense of relief. It was so much better doing a job like this as a team, and thankfully he had brought a powerful light source with him, which made all the difference. I imagine the husband will turn up, I told Mark. You know the usual story with the frantic spouse imagining all kinds of weird scenarios have happened to their loved one. Mark nodded at me knowingly. As we ventured into the forest, it was eerily quiet. The stillness was provocative. It rarely disturbed me because I was used to the sounds of crickets and animal calls that we so often in this part of the world hear. I could see Mark looking increasingly uncomfortable. These woods are sinister, he remarked. Something doesn't feel right here, don't you think? I was glad that Mark was feeling it too. Clearly, I was not imagining things. I had sensed that something was terribly wrong too, but what was out of place, I really could not say. Suddenly we could smell the foulest odour in the air, and it was positively revolting, reminding me of a decaying skunk. That's how foul the smell was. What in the world is that smell? Remarked Mark. I've never smelt anything so vile in my entire life. The more we ventured into the woods, the stronger and more horrendous the smell became. We noticed that all over the woods the tree limbs had been torn out of the ground, rather like weeds from a lawn. Who had the power to pull out heavy 1,000-pound trunks out by the roots? I wondered in astonishment. Hear that? I asked Mark. I could hear the sound of an animal snorting. For a moment I thought it was a hog, and I knew how formidable encounters with these creatures could be, because they can be prone to aggression. Hopefully, if this creature saw us, it would just run away, especially if we didn't bother it. I expected to see a hog, but that's not what I saw. Dangling from a tree branch was a man's hand. It had been tied to the tree purposefully with a piece of long grass. Whoever had done this was leaving a clear message to stay away, well, at least that's what I thought. Or maybe it was designed to just scare us off. Mark and I stared at the horrific sight in disbelief. I was now very concerned because it was more than likely that Lisa's husband had come to an untimely end. I was concerned that he had become a victim of foul play, because predators do not hang hands on trees. Whoever had done this was extremely intelligent, so it had to be human, and a macabre one at that, who clearly got off on scaring people half to death. I immediately called for backup, because now I was concerned. Once again I heard the snorting sound, and became increasingly uncomfortable because I was wondering if the man who had harmed Lisa's husband was still loitering around the forest. He was clearly someone completely insane, I thought, or a nut that was short of a bolt. Suddenly we heard the most formidable growl. It went right through our body, almost like a bass sound. I do not know how else to explain it, but I will say this. It put a feeling of impending dread throughout my entire being. I knew with certainty that the sound was not of human origin. It was more supernatural than anything else. Almost at once I could feel eyes on me, and I knew that who or whatever this predator was, they were watching us in the same way that a savage creature stalks out its prey. I was praying in my heart, please God, make the backup team come now, please God, make the backup team come now, please God, please. Mark and I held our rifles in our hands as we surveyed our surroundings, carefully looking for any sign of movement so that we could unload our rifles into the surrounding thicket. Suddenly we could see this dark form gliding towards us with such stealth and grace, almost like a great, magnificent cat in pursuit of its prey. Whatever it was looked almost like an apparition in the ominous darkness of the forest. Once my torchlight caught a glimpse of the creature, I almost screamed out in horror. This creature, whatever it was the most hideous thing that I had ever seen in my entire life. In that moment, I almost saw my life flashing before me, like you would if you knew that you were yards away from an apex predator that would invariably maul you to death. I have never in all my born days tasted, smelt, and touched death like I did in those moments. I could feel the rising levels of bittersweet adrenaline coursing through my veins as my whole body trembled in terror. This monstrously ugly bipedal creature that stood before us was about 800 to 900 pounds, and he was very stockily built, with enormous chunky proportions. I would say that his massive chest measured at the very least 7 feet across. All over his body he was covered with the ghastliest black dreadlocks that looked matted and tangled and hung off his body in big tufts. His shoulder was very large and supported a bullet-like head with no neck to speak of. He had a long, hairless, primate-looking face with a very large squashed nose, a thin, mean-looking mouth, and the largest blazing red eyes I have ever seen. This creature was human, but he was not human. He was ape, but he was not ape. What in the world was this creature, I wondered, eyeing the thing in horror? Could something like this be real? Could it really be real? Or was my mind playing tricks on me, I wondered. Whatever it was, I knew with certainty that you would never believe such a beast existed unless you saw it with your own eyes. If you told anyone about this beast, they would never believe you. Never, not even in a million trillion years, I thought. The creature raised the corner of his mouth and let out a threatening snarl, showing a mouth full of smooth, human-looking teeth that were much larger than ours. I could feel myself shaking in terror, and it was impossible to stand still, which meant it was hard to keep my hands steady, so I kept my rifle focused on this creature. Should I pull the trigger, I wondered. I was afraid that my rifle was no match for this beast. I could tell he had the strength to tear both Mark and I in half like a piece of paper. There were no manuals written on how to deal with something like this. Should I play dead? Should I stand still, run, scream, shoot, or what? I just didn't know what the answer was. Supposing I unloaded my rifle, would that make the creature react even more violently and cause us more serious physical harm? Somehow I felt that shooting at this thing would be madness, because the creature looked like he was impulsive, reactive, and very unpredictable. My thoughts travelled back to the human hand that was tied on a branch. Had Lisa's husband maddened this beast by shooting at him? Somehow I expected that that is what had happened. It was almost like an inexplanatory knowing that shot into my mind like a crystal clear revelation that long after the event I was never able to explain. "Whatever you do, Mark," I said slowly, "do not unload your rifle, because if you do, we are both dead, and I mean dead." Mark was wobbling frantically like a blancmange jelly, and I noticed that even his teeth were chattering violently, while there were beads of perspiration on his forehead that ran down his face like salty tears. "Is this thing not going to kill us anyway?" he said. "Let's just both shoot now. What have we got to lose?" "Please don't," I said to Mark as calmly as I could. "Trust me on this one, please." The creature continued to snarl at us like an aggressive dog, and all the while he seemed to be studying us and watching our rifles closely at the very same time. Suddenly he made a sound of a rifle going off, and I promise you that sound was the real deal. He imitated that sound to perfection. It was like he was telling us he knew what our rifles were, and he was not the least bit happy about them. He repeated the same sounds, imitating a rifle going off, and pointed his sausage-like fingers at us as if he was mimicking the action of a rifle. It was extraordinary how this beast was able to step into the perfect role of playing or acting like a shooter. His reenactment was flawless, and I was stunned. He even acted as if he had been shot. He laid his gargantuan hands on an area of flesh on his leg and let out a whimper, and then he pretended to limp. I was astonished. The creature had given us an Academy Award-winning performance, and I could see he had superior intelligence, and frankly, I was stunned. I looked at Mark, and he was in a terrible state. I realized he was shaking more violently than I was, with undisputed terror, and he had no control over his rifle that wobbled precariously in his hands. Suddenly I told Mark to put his rifle on the ground so that the creature could clearly see it as an act of surrender. Mark obeyed my instructions while protesting all the while. "Are you stark raving mad?" he said. I also put down my rifle, and the creature visibly relaxed. I saw the crinkles on his deep furrowed forehead dissolve and disappear as his grey skin suddenly smoothed out. He then took both our rifles from the ground and tossed them down a steep incline into the valley below. Suddenly the creature almost looked bored with us, as if we were a couple of toddlers who had got on his nerves, and he'd had just about enough and more than he could take. The creature suddenly yawned, looked extremely disinterested in us, and then, like an agile pussycat, he literally jumped down the steep incline to the valley below, where our guns had landed. Perfectly on his 2 feet he landed, and then he was gone, sounding as heavy and as loud as a steam train on full throttle, thundering through the valley. Then he was gone from our sight and sound. I looked down at my legs and feet in surprise. I was still in one piece and very much alive. I could hardly believe my luck. I was almost certain that I would have been dead by now. The relief was almost more overwhelming for me than the fear itself. Mark looked more surprised than I was that the creature had gone. This grown, brave man started to whimper and blubber like a puppy, and he burst into uncontrollable tears. I comforted him like a mother calming down a frantic child. "It's going to be all right," I promised. "The creature has gone, and I have a good feeling that he's not coming back. We both bored him half to death, and I think he wants nothing to do with us." It seemed like a while before the backup team of police officers did finally arrive. I was not going to tell them what had just transpired. I knew for a start they would never believe us. And so Mark and I just acted as if we had seen absolutely nothing. We heard the creature, I told them, but are clueless as to what it could have been. And Mark backed up my story. I climbed down the steep valley to retrieve our rifles from the valley floor and was stunned by how the creature had leaped down the incline so effortlessly. If I had copied the creature, I would almost certainly have broken both my ankles and maybe a few other bones as well. The police retrieved the hand they found tied to the branch. I think they thought I tied it there for safekeeping. That's the impression I gave him. I told them I didn't have any string. I was not about to tell them the truth. Sadly, the body that belonged to the missing hand was never found, but presumed deceased. There were tons of rifle bullets littered and scattered all over the forest, and I knew why Lisa's husband had met an untimely end. He had gone ballistic and firing at that creature. I imagine the creature was furious at being shot at, knew what the rifle meant, and as a result he just launched a deadly attack on Lisa's husband. But what he did with the body was a mystery, because it was completely gone and no sign of those human bones were ever recovered. I was the one who had to tell Lisa the sad news of her husband's demise, and I will tell you this, she was extremely brave and stoic. I was amazed, and I was impressed how she handled such a crushing revelation. She looked at me and said, "I always felt that he would go like this. I just somehow always knew it, but I never knew why." I looked at her and said, "You mean like this clear, unexplainable knowing?" She nodded. I knew what she meant, because I had just had that revelation in the forest earlier. So there you are. That is my story. All I can say is what a wonderful story. I'm so dumbfounded by that story, and it resonates with me somehow. I definitely think that the creature might actually have been a victim of a gun attack before, because I think it's very interesting the way he acted like he'd been injured and he started limping. Either he had seen another Bigfoot have a gun shot at him, or maybe he himself had experienced what it was like to be shot at. And clearly he was so enraged, which was why he actually killed Lisa's husband. But I think when the other two put down their guns as an act of surrender, he suddenly realized, well, I don't have to be worried anymore. So that was an extraordinary story, and we just really loved it. Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. I'm so very glad you've joined me this evening. I've got the most wonderful story for you that you are really going to love. And it's about this gentleman who took a woman on a camping trip, and she wasn't quite the perfect companion that he had hoped she would be. So let's get started. I know you're going to enjoy the story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my Bigfoot encounter happened in the early 80s in an area of national forest in Oregon when I was 18 years old. Before I tell you my story, let me introduce myself. My name is Bob, and I have lived in Colorado all of my life. One day I was invited to a barbecue-style open pool party at my friend Taylor's house, who was celebrating at the time his 21st birthday. I remember as I was helping myself to some delicious birthday cake, I accidentally dropped a little piece on this woman's red stiletto shoe. I hastily brushed off the excessive cream and cake with my tissue that was in my pocket and apologized profusely, only to find myself staring up into the most beautiful blue eyes belonging to this ravishing blonde bombshell who looked as if she had stepped off the cover of a magazine. I found out her name was Claudia, and as we chatted, I did not really take in a word she was saying because I was so smitten by her. Her appearance was stunning. Everything about her was flawless, from her seemingly perfect skin tone to her smooth highlighted hair and manicured bright pink nails. I could hardly believe my luck that she had not been snatched up by some amorous, handsome-looking male. In short, she was available to date me, and that was extraordinary. In my naivety and brazen immaturity, I did not realize that the outer cover does not always match the inside. Little did I realize that this would become horribly apparent to me in the days that were to follow, where I would inevitably regret the very day that I laid my eyes on the lovely Claudia. It all started when I suggested we both go camping, and believe it or not, Claudia seemed very excited about it. I told her we would be living in very rough conditions, eating freeze-dried food, as well as boiling water from the lake, and sleeping in sleeping bags in a tent. It would be rudimentary and basic, I warned her. I remember that beautiful day when we set out. It was so lovely. It was a warm, sunny day, and I was enjoying our walk and taking in the beautiful scenery from the clear azure blue sky to the lush green vegetation and the tall, regal trees of the forest. We heard beautiful birdsong and watched cute little squirrels darting from tree to tree, and also saw the occasional chipmunk eyeing us with curiosity. It was a glorious day, and as I was looking so forward to roughing it out here, I was going to enjoy myself in this earthly paradise. Not once did Claudia marvel at the great outdoors and the serene beauty and magic of the forest. Instead, the moaning and groaning and protesting started almost immediately. "It's too hot, and I'm so tired," she complained. Next, she was bored out of her skull. "I just wish I was back home," she would say. The next thing I knew was she was screaming at the top of her lungs, "Ah!" And I rushed over to her side to see what was wrong. I thought something terrible had happened to her, like being bitten by a snake. But no, she had snagged her nail and was crying out bitterly. "My nail varnish is ruined," she screamed. "Do you have any idea how expensive my manicures are? It's this awful place. I wish I'd never come. I hate it here." I went red with embarrassment as I saw a couple who were hiking past us, looking at us curiously. Why would anyone want to have a tantrum in a place as enchanting and serene as this, I wondered. What was wrong with this girl? I was beginning to find Claudia extremely annoying, and the hardened scowl on her face grew longer and longer by the second, and I was beginning to loathe the very sight of her. I even began to ask myself how I had ever found her physically attractive. All the things that had initially captivated me about the lovely Claudia seemed to have dissolved almost instantly, and now even her physical appearance had lost its appeal, and I began to find her unattractive. I cannot tell you how much a drag Claudia was. You would have had to be there to actually physically see it to believe it. We set out our camp for the night in a beautiful clearing, yards away from the pristine lake that shimmered like the most incredible silver under the noonday sun. I prepared a beautiful crackling fire for us and brewed some hot coffee for Claudia, who took a sip and threw it in the ground in disgust. "I'm not drinking this nasty swill," she complained. I prepared our freeze-dried meal, which I cooked in a pot over a mini portable gas hob. It was a perfectly decent dish of stew and rice. Claudia took one bite and spat it out and then threw the rest of it on the ground. "I am not eating this stuff. It's utterly disgusting." "There's nothing wrong with it," I assured her. "It actually tastes rather good. Just give it another go." "Well," she complained, "your standards are way too low. You wouldn't know better." I wish I could say I was a gentleman, but I'm ashamed to say I am not. I just lost it with Claudia, I'm afraid, and I told her some hard-home truths. I told her that she was a spoilt little brat who was ungrateful and selfish and could not see a good thing if it came up and bit her in the face. I also told her that I warned her that camping was not for the faint-hearted and that she would have to rough it, and she had agreed to come under those circumstances. Claudia was enraged with me. "You never told me that I would be bitten by mosquitoes, nor did you tell me I would eat dog food or drink pond swill and have such a boring time with someone as mean, as insensitive as you. If I had known what you are really like, I would never have come, not in a million years." With that, she stamped her foot like an obstinate child and said, "I'm out of here." And with that, she marched off in a terrible huff. I'm afraid to say I called her bluff. I really thought Claudia would go nowhere further away from our tent, just somewhere close by to sulk. I had no idea that she would be so incredibly obstinate and stubborn and pig-headed that she would storm off into the surrounding countryside all on her own, without anything to protect herself from any impending danger. I sat down in my sleeping bag and took a quick nap, but I woke up 3 hours later to find that Claudia was not in the tent and was nowhere to be found. I began cursing myself privately for speaking my mind to Claudia. If only I had gritted my teeth and been nice to her, however hard that was. Now she could be anywhere in the forest, and she could get herself into all kinds of terrible, terrible trouble. It was a cool night, and Claudia did not have anything warm on, and that was not a good start. And neither did she have a torch, so she would not be able to see very clearly. Darkness had spread over the valley, and the only light generated on this night was the low glow of the half-moon. I was growing increasingly worried about Claudia, as I was responsible for taking care of her, and I had really let her down horribly. I spent ages searching for Claudia and calling out her name, and then suddenly I heard her screams. I was not sure what to think. Had she torn another nail, I wondered, or was she just terribly afraid of the dark? I had no idea that Claudia could be in real danger. She had cried wolf out too many times. I scrambled as quickly as I could through the forest towards the sound of Claudia's screams. Then I found her. She was standing there with a long stick in her arms, waving it aggressively at 3 creatures that just stood there staring at her with remarkably surprised looks on their long primate-looking faces. "Kill them!" screamed Claudia as I approached. "Kill the hairy, ugly monsters! Kill them now! Where is your rifle? Hurry! They're going to kill me!" I found myself standing before 3 creatures. I studied them with the light of my torch, which did not please them at all as the light bothered their eyes. What was I seeing, I wondered in awe and in total amazement. Standing before us was 3 dark, shadowy forms that were covered in black hair, and the tallest creature was about 7 foot tall, while the other 2 were shorter at 6 feet. They were not bears, I thought. What on earth were they? I have never seen anything like them before, and I'd never even heard of creatures like this. I didn't even know that such creatures existed. The heads were almost shaped like a cone, and the faces were hairless with very flat noses, slim mouths, and brown eyes that flickered with red eyeshine when they were in the dark. Their bodies were incredibly strong, muscular, and broad, especially in the shoulder area and chest. I would say at a guess they weighed about 500 pounds each, or more. When Claudia screamed shrilly, they would cover their ears because they could not bear the sound of her screams, almost if the frequency of her screams literally hurt their ears. They did not move but stood there silently, like three frozen statues, just staring at us in bewilderment. I think they were more shocked to see us than we were to see them. At least that was the impression I got. Not once did they come across aggressive, angry, or even retaliatory, which was surprising considering the way that Claudia was behaving. If I had been in their shoes, I would have been reactive. In this situation, the aggressor was obviously Claudia, who was waving the long stick at the creatures angrily and screaming non-stop like a banshee all the while. Suddenly one of the creatures reached out and grabbed the stick from Claudia's hands. He broke it into 1,000 pieces and threw it across the forest floor. The creatures then just grunted and started to walk away, and the others followed him, not looking back even once. "See," I said to Claudia, "those creatures, they weren't going to hurt you." Claudia could not stop sobbing. "They were going to kill me," she screamed. "Could you not see that? Are you that blind? Why did you not kill the horrible hairy monsters? They were so ugly and disgusting. Are you a wimp or what?" "Why do you think they were going to kill you?" I asked. "Well, look how big and dangerous they are." There was no reasoning with Claudia, who claimed she had walked into a tree that turned out to be one of those creatures, and she was so terrified she grabbed a branch and started to threaten them. "Did they ever growl at you?" I asked, "or did they do anything to frighten you?" "No," she said, "but look how scary they are." I'm not going to kill something just because it looks scary, especially if it's not threatening you. Those creatures were incredibly peaceful. Not once were they retaliatory, I explained. Claudia was not convinced and started to sulk because in her world she inhabits, everything is governed by appearance. I began to realize. In her shallow mind, something beautiful was good, and if it did not conform to her high expectations of beauty, then it just had to be bad. For her, there was no in-between. Everything was black or white. The next day, Claudia and I returned to Colorado. I did not want to spend another agonizing day with a woman. All these years later, I learnt that Claudia had been through 7 marriages and counting. And quite frankly, I wasn't surprised. It was 10 years that went by before I realized the creatures we saw that day were Bigfoots or Sasquatches. And I was really surprised to learn about other people's terrifying accounts. Mine was anything but. I found the creatures to be extremely docile and gentle. At least that's the impression they gave me. If they had been aggressive, I do admit, that would have been terrifying. So there you are. That is my encounter that would never have transpired if it had not been for my volatile girlfriend. Maybe there was something good about her after all, because if it hadn't been for her, I may never have met a Bigfoot. Well, that is the most wonderful story. I just love that. And I can actually see that girl going through the woods and being the most horrific company, because clearly she just did not appreciate her natural environment. And I can't imagine that. I can't imagine going to a beautiful part of the world and being close to nature and complaining about everything, because there is nothing that is more beautiful than being close to nature. So it's crazy to me. But what an amazing story about that encounter with those creatures. And it's incredible that despite the fact that Claudia was being aggressive to them, they were not having any of it. They just looked at her as if she was some silly little schoolgirl, and they walked away. Well, anyway, love to all of you, all around the world, and especially in North America. Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. I'm so very glad you've joined me this evening, and I know you're going to love tonight's story. What it is that there was a lovely lady who was married to a groomsman, and she was actually also working as a groom. but she was very fortunate because she had actually worked in Rwanda with silverback gorillas, so she knew quite a lot about primate behavior. And because she had that experience behind her, she had told her husband quite a lot about silverbacks and the way they behave. And so when her husband had a Bigfoot encounter, he remembered what his wife had said about silverbacks and how to deal with them in an aggressive situation. And so that's exactly what he did, and that saved his life. So it's a remarkable story. But before we get started, I just want to send my love to my amazing subscribers all over North America and Canada. I love you guys so much. Thank you so much for your support and your encouragement and your kind and lovely words. I'm so grateful to have you on my team. And I really hope you enjoy tonight's story. And if you haven't subscribed, don't forget to do so. And make sure you also click the bell button so that you can always know when another one of my stories is available, because I download stories every single day and I don't want you to miss out. So let's get started. You're going to love this story. Dear Sarah and all your listeners, my name is Jonathan and I live in the most perfect Bigfoot location imaginable in the beautiful hills of West Virginia. I live in an extremely idyllic Scandinavian-style post and beam log cabin with my family, which belongs to the owner of this large country estate, where I'm fortunate enough to work and reside. Let's just call my employer William Carter for the purposes of my story. I work for William as the head groomsman here, and I'm in charge of 3 other grooms that work under my guidance and supervision with all the horses. My job requires an extensive understanding and knowledge of horses, from the varying breeds and different temperaments. I am expected to be on call both day and night, especially if I'm dealing with a sick or injured horse that may require my special undivided care and attention. As you can imagine, my work involves giving the horses excellent nutrition, proper veterinary care, regular exercise, hoof shodding, grooming, and washing horses. It goes without saying that looking after the horses, including the less desirable jobs like mucking out the stables and cleaning up after the horses, is physically exhausting and demanding. So it is not for the faint-hearted, believe me. You really need to love horses in this kind of work. I can assure you that from a lucrative perspective, my pay package is not that special. But bear in mind, I live in an exquisite, decent-sized cabin with my family completely rent-free, without needing to pay the overhead costs for gas or electricity, etc., etc. I'm also doing my dream kind of work, which is working with horses, which for me, it just doesn't get better than that. My wife Annabelle is one of the grooms working under my charge, and she is an invaluable member of my special team, as well as being an incredibly competent rider. We are very fortunate that we both share the same passion. Our daughter Ruth is homeschooled here on the premises by my wife, who supervises her educational needs. On Williams Carter's land, there are so many magnificent wilderness horse trails, which means sometimes we manage riding excursions for members of the public once or twice a year, which brings in extra income, which is always useful. I love and adore working in this part of the world with its magnificent rolling hills, beautiful valleys, glorious silvery lakes and lily-covered ponds, not to mention all the ubiquitous trees that create the lush areas of natural forest and untouched timber that we have here. There is an abundance of enviable wildlife here that would also make our property an ideal location for hunting enthusiasts, but it's not something we rarely engage in on our land. However, the animals do have predators here, I assure you. I've seen a cougar and some coyotes, as well as bears, and even a mountain lion on our land before. So I imagine they are doing their bit in culling our deer population. Believe me, we have got some trophy-looking prize buck on our land that most hunters would kill for. To wake up to this part of the world every day and breathe in the refreshing, invigorating country air, and enjoy the magnificent panoramic views over the valley is for me the ideal life and my idea of heaven. My Bigfoot story happened in 2007, but before I tell you my story, I want to tell you that I knew nothing about the hairy man called Bigfoot. Maybe I'd heard about him somewhere, but if I did, I have no recollection about such a revelation. Quite frankly, if you told me there could be a gorilla man gallivanting around our land, I would have considered the notion highly improbable and extremely unlikely. You see, I've never seen anything obvious on our land that would make me remotely suspicious as to the existence of such a creature. But then again, I knew nothing about what signs to look for when it came to Bigfoot. 2 years prior to my Bigfoot encounter, I do recall evenings when there were no crickets singing and there were no animal sounds in the valley, and I always noticed at those times that my horses I took charge over were usually very distressed. As a groom, this continued to concern me, and I did wonder if a predator was around, but the last thing on my mind was a Bigfoot. I tended to veer towards a cougar or a mountain lion. My wife had spent some time in her youth working with silverback gorillas in the Rwandan jungle, and she told me how extraordinary they were. She said they had the ability to hide so well that even in close proximity to them, they became invisible. So she told me they knew how to blend in with their environment so spectacularly. I gather it's all about survival, learning to become one with your environment, and that primates knew how to do this with effortless ease. It is known as prime cam, which means a primate is camouflaged by its environment. One night my wife called me out of the cozy warm cabin into the stillness of the freezing night. "Listen," she said in an excited whisper. "You hear that whooping sound?" I nodded, wondering why on earth she looked so thrilled. "It sounds like a primate," she said to me in shock. "Who would have thought it out here in the heart of the West Virginia of all places?" "You think a gorilla has got loose?" I asked her in surprise. "I suppose anything is possible," she said. "Remember that case when a tiger owner dropped his dangerous cat into a mountainous ravine somewhere in Tennessee, I think it was? Can you imagine what it must have been like to encounter such a creature on your home turf? It would have freaked me out," she said. I nodded in agreement. I cannot imagine, and I would not want to either, how irresponsible that person must have been to let out a wild animal like that could ravage a human without any difficulty. Suddenly, my wife started to make primate calls that she used to do when she was working with silverbacks into the valley to see if she got a response. And I was amazed because she did. I was floored. Something had answered her back. We could hear a very clear return whoop. "How odd," she said, walking back into the cabin. "That was definitely a primate of some kind. But what on earth is it doing out here? And it has to be not too far away," she reflected. I gave the matter no further thought until one night I went to check on my horses in the nearby stables, and they appeared to be exceedingly distressed, and the whinnying noises that they were making were nothing like I'd ever heard before. As I approached the stables, I suddenly felt that I was not alone. Someone was watching me, but who and why? It was the most foreboding feeling I have ever experienced, made worse by the fact that despite the frightened noises coming from the horses, everything else on this night was eerily quiet, and even the crickets had ceased singing their nightly chorus. As I entered the stables, the fear from the horses' anxious energy was palpable, and it got my own heart racing, I do not mind admitting. Something had clearly distressed them. I noticed the mother, who was guarding her foal, looked the most distressed of all the horses. I could see how agitated she was, and I was surprised to see some bloody marks and several long scratch marks on the top of her left hind leg, which was startling to say the least, almost as if some savage animal had clawed her with his sharp talons. I attended to her wounds immediately, that were luckily not deep enough for stitches, but something had clearly scratched her badly. But who or what? I had no idea. I came to the conclusion that a predator of some kind had clearly entered the stables and had its eye on the young foal, which would explain the mother's distress. I considered her wounds may have been caused from protecting her young one from this predator. When you live on a land with so much wildlife, why on earth would a predator come into an area with human habitation, when the valleys below are filled with easy meals, from turkeys to grouse, rabbits, and the list goes on? It was the most bewildering and extremely bizarre. I also hasten to mention that there was this damp, odorous smell in the stables that was pungent and utterly revolting. So I knew that something had been in our stables, and so I put a couple of trail cams on a couple of outside trees in the hope that I could suss out what this mystery predator may be. All was quiet for a few nights until there was another commotion in the stables, and as I rushed outside the cabin, I caught a glimpse of this red eye shine at least 7 feet off the ground. What in the heck is that? I wondered, rushing towards the stables to attend to my frightened horses. You could be forgiven for thinking it was an owl on a branch, but I assure you there was no branch to perch on there, so those eyes belonged to something tall, something of at least over 7 feet. I immediately checked all my trail cams and was horrified to see that the cameras had been deliberately turned to face in another direction when I had specifically focused them directly on the stables. It was all exceedingly odd, and something intelligent had clearly done this. Fortunately, months passed without any further incidents, I'm glad to say. One day, on one of the horse riding trails, we suddenly saw this dark 8-foot form crossing our path, but it happened so fast that no one could really affirm what we saw. There were arguments about whether it was a bear, but no one believed a bear could run quite so fast and vanish quite so quickly, and one of the riders said she could swear that the thing, whatever it was, had human-like hands. One day I ventured along our horse trail path and checking the area to make sure there were no obstacles on the trail, like thorn bushes and so forth that may need cutting back. You see, the rambling, dense thicket in this area is unforgivingly full of barbs and thorns, and I want to make sure that both horses and riders do not succumb to the wrath of those reckless spikes that can literally tear your skin to shreds. Suddenly I felt that foreboding feeling that something and someone was watching me, and my blood went cold like ice. I could literally feel the hairs on my arms standing on end. Why was I reacting like this when there was nothing there? All was very still, in fact alarmingly so. There was pretty bird song in the valley that had ceased, and all seemed incredibly quiet. I could still feel eyes on me, and I instinctively knew it was a predator. I always carry a hunting rifle with me because of the various encounters I've had in the past with wild animals. I looked around and peered through my scope haphazardly, focusing my rifle in all manner of directions. Not being able to see a predator that you know is close by has got to be the most unnerving, terrifying feeling that causes total vulnerability and helplessness. Where do you aim your rifle? That thing could be anywhere and pounce on you when your back is turned. I knew that very well. I knew this well because I knew of a person who was killed by a mountain lion once. And believe me, this thing was so sneaky, it was on top of him before he had a hope in hell of escaping. He didn't even hear it before it mounted him. Suddenly I heard this low guttural warning growl, and it was the most disorientating sound I have ever heard in my entire life, because it literally caused my whole body to tremble, and it just would not stop. I had no physical control over the overwhelming anxiety as it physically coursed through my body at an alarming speed. Even my heartbeat had accelerated, and I heard the fast pumping sounds of its beat racing violently through my chest like a heavy drum. Then there it was, Several yards away from me, towards the left-hand side of the valley, a humongous creature stood there with round, almond-shaped dark eyes, staring at me with a look of incandescent rage written over his hairless, primate-looking face. This animal, whatever it was, had no pleasure in my presence. I got the instinct impression that this was his territory and I was not welcome here. What the heck is this creature, I wondered. I'd never seen anything like it before. The creature was 8 foot tall and 800 pounds easily, and it was covered with dark auburn brown hair that was quite thick apart from his face and knee pads. The arms were long, just like a silverback's, only exceedingly muscular. I imagined this creature could stand erect and easily touch his ankles without bending over, and I'm almost certain that although the creature was bipedal, it could run on all fours with effortless ease. In my opinion, the term ape man would have been the perfect analogy to describe this formidable foe, because he had aspects of a human and aspects of an ape in his appearance. The creature had that typical cone-shaped head, muscular rounded shoulders, and a very wide torso and chest area. His huge legs were muscular and strong. Indeed, this creature exuded power, strength, and agility in every area of his body. As for that face, I will never forget it for as long as I live. Especially the furious eyes, the furrowed head, thin lips, and very flat squashed nose. The creature was thumping his chest furiously, and I knew that was a sign of anger and aggression, and I knew I was in trouble. If a silverback gorilla is equivalent to 4 males in strength, what on earth would this thing do to me at 800 pounds in weight? All I can say is that I was horrified as I began to realize I might not be leaving this place alive. I had haunting visions of my body ripped apart, torn into shreds like a broken doll, lying splattered all over the wilderness, only to be devoured by the coyotes, eager to dine over my leftovers. Then there would be nothing left of me, and I would be listing as one of the many that go missing every year in North America. The creature started to mock charge me, and I just froze to the spot. And all I could do was try and remember what my wife had told me about silverbacks. She had said, bend down, avert your gaze, don't look at the creature, and show that you're absolutely no threat. Be very submissive. So that is exactly what I did. I mean, what did I have to lose? I was going to die anyway, but why not die fighting to survive? And if making yourself small worked with silverbacks, maybe it would work with this god-awful thing also. Whatever it was, maybe there was a small gleam of hope, I thought. You're probably wondering why I did not use my rifle on this creature, and the answer might surprise you. I really felt that if I had used my rifle, I would have been dead before I pulled the trigger. I think I knew the better word to use is, yes, I knew I would be dead if I touched the trigger. That certainly is in my mind. This creature reacts so fast, and I believe it knew what my rifle was. It was exceedingly intelligent. Just as I assume it was the one that had turned my trail cams the other way, it also knew what those trail cams were. So it possibly knew what this was too. The creature was sharp, intelligent, and instinctive. As the creature continued to exert his anger towards me by shaking his fists, thumping his chest, and releasing a throaty growl that was so terrifying it literally put the fear of God throughout my whole body. I threw my rifle to the ground, averted my gaze from the creature, and made myself as small as possible so that I looked like a large ball on the ground. I followed my wife's advice to the letter. I saw the hairy man touch my back briefly with a light pressure using the back of his foot. Then I heard him grunt and snort as if satisfied, and I could tell the creature seemed to have calmed down immensely. And then, much to my amazement, he just walked away, just like that. OMG, it worked, I thought. Never had I been more grateful that my wife had worked with silverback. Her advice may have just saved me my life. When I returned to the cabin, my wife was horrified to see me in such a dreadful state. I promise you the post-traumatic trauma I experienced after the event was almost worse than the encounter itself. Just a mere memory of the encounter made me break out in hives and have panic attacks. Once I'd done some research, I was amazed to find that I'd encountered a Sasquatch or a Bigfoot. My wife believes that he is real because of the primate calls that she heard on our land when she called out. She also believes that the reason people do not see them is because, like other primates, like the silverback she knew in Rwanda, Bigfoot knows how to be invisible in plain sight. My wife gave me the best advice, and that is to leave well alone. Let him have that area, she told me. He was angry with you because he was being territorial, and he would have fought you to the death if he thought you were a threat. So that is what I've done. I've changed the riding trails so that they don't border on the northwest side of the land, and that is fine by me. It will be too soon if I ever see that Bigfoot again. It would be nothing for him to have killed me in an instant. He knew it, and I knew it too. I am stunned to have encountered a creature like this. Some may describe it as a privilege, but for me it was an encounter I would have paid big bucks to avoid. Even now I suffer post-traumatic stress and am receiving counselling which has helped me a lot. If you are in any doubt about the hairy man, believe me, he is very real because I've seen him myself. And I assure you, as creative as I may be, I would never be able to make this stuff up. Thank you so very much for that incredible story. I love the way you describe what it's like to be a groomsman and what it was like working on the land and the strange encounters that you had and the red eye shine and the way that you copied the silverback in literally becoming very submissive to the creature, and that appeared to work. And I think that could be one of the explanations why Bigfoot is so invisible to so many of us. And that even though we may hear the whooping sounds, we look around and we can't see Bigfoot because he knows how to blend in with his environment, that even if he's right in front of us, he'll appear invisible. So that was the most fantastic story, which I hope everyone enjoyed as much as I did. I'm so delighted you've joined me this evening, and I have got the most lovely story for you that you're going to love. It's in fact a family who discovers a frozen Bigfoot. Can you imagine that? That must have been the most extraordinary thing to uncover, especially since the family had no idea what a Bigfoot was. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. And I just want to send my love to all my subscribers and listeners around the world in North America, Canada, and Kenya, wherever you may be. Loads and loads of love to you. And let's get started. I know you're going to enjoy the story. Dear Sarah, my name is Sharon and I'm from West Virginia. My parents bought an abandoned house in the Blue Ridge Mountain area in October of 2013. No one knew what had happened to the previous owners because they fled the property, and to date the police have not been able to locate them. They are registered as missing and presumed dead, as far as I can gather. They have never accessed their bank accounts or been in touch with family members further afield. I mean, how do 4 people just vanish off the face of the earth just like that, without so much as a trace? It's quite extraordinary. The 1870 property was auctioned by the bank and was in a dreadful state of disrepair, and it still contained the previous owner's furniture and even the remnants of their last dinner before they just vanished. It's as if something quite dreadful must have transpired while they were eating their dinner. I could see the remnants of dried up butternut squash on their dinner plates, which gave me a horrible chill down my spine. What had happened that night to these poor innocent people? What it was must have been quite terrible, I thought. The property went for a song, and my father snapped it up very quickly as he is into building construction, so he was determined to build us our dream, asymmetrical, contemporary, modern home, and so that is exactly what he did. You know the kind I mean, with seamless finishes, flat roof, and extensive large living areas with huge windows. The property was located on 40 acres of overgrown, rambling brush, as the garden was taken over by various long weeds and creeping, variegated vines that had transformed the garden into a dense jungle of overgrown thicket. The land had huge potential though, because it is a wooded area and there was a stunning creek and plenty of abundant wildlife. At first glance, I was furious that my dad bought such a sinister looking, horrible place that looked so creepy and oppressive. It was hard for me to see the potential of something as hideously ugly as this vacant home. It truly looked like a derelict, haunted location, and hardly the kind of place I would ever be pleased to call my home. Also, knowing that something so dreadful may have happened to the previous occupants did nothing to dull my deep cynicism about my father's impulsive purchase. While the building was in progress, we stayed in a trailer on the premises, and there were many times I cursed the very day my father had taken on such a long-suffering building project. It was hard for me to see my father's vision for the place, because all I could see was a huge mess and an overgrown jungle. When the old house was in the throes of being demolished, we noticed other details about the house that we previously had overlooked. There were some deep, angry gashes that could be seen all over the wood panels of the home, almost as if someone had deliberately vandalized the place or tried to break in. There were several windows that had been broken through and were heavily boarded up from the inside out by the previous owner, almost as if they had been trying as best as they could to keep something out. Even crazier were the inside doors that were all heavily bolted. It was like Fort Knox with double locks everywhere. There were metal-barred security gates erected on the inside of every single room, including the kitchen, the back door, and the front door. Whoever had owned this house had gone to extreme lengths in regards to their stringent security protocol, which seemed excessive for an idyllic location like the Blue Ridge Mountains. Something must have freaked the family out so much, I thought. Whatever it was, I hoped with all my heart and prayed that it wouldn't come after us once we had finally moved in. Then, on March the 3rd, 2014, our area was hit with the most terrible heavy snow, sleet and frozen rain, and areas around our home like Oklahoma, New Jersey and Virginia were hit really badly, and there were major problems in the Blue Ridge Mountain area and the Shenandoah Valley, including the Richmond area, as well as Interstates 81 and 64. So we were very badly affected by the extreme weather conditions and suffered the ravages of sub-zero temperatures. I remember how bitterly cold it was on that day. But as the garden had recently been renovated and restored, and the jungle-like garden completely cleared up and all the mess removed, my sister Janice and I discovered a lovely hilly slope at the far end of the property that was large enough for tobogganing, and despite the horrendous, harrowing weather conditions, we both really wanted to try out the hilly slope for the first time with our toboggans. My mother was not keen at all on the idea, especially because of the weather conditions. She suggested that there would be many times in the future when the conditions were less chaotic and hazardous that we could go tobogganing on the hill. But after much begging, my mother finally agreed and allowed us to go. My sister and I wasted no time in racing outdoors. I still remember that day so vividly and how dreadfully cold it was, and I could feel the icy sleet numbing my face as we ventured out of doors. I knew my mother was right. These conditions were crazy for tobogganing, but I was not going to return indoors with my tail between my legs, admitting how right my mother was. I was adventurous and always had been, and I was hardly going to let this bad weather, no matter how chaotic, stop me from having loads of fun. And so before long, Janice and I were enjoying ourselves going up and down the hilly slope on our toboggans, having heaps of fun and laughing continuously. Suddenly on my downhill ride, I hit something very hard that was sticking out of the snow, and it caused me to fly in the air like a frisbee, where I finally landed on the soft snow in the lower valley beneath us. I'm glad to say that all that was wounded was my pride, thank goodness. My father, who had been watching us with a look of amusement on his face, wasted no time in rushing up the hilly slope to investigate what it was that had tripped me up on my downhill ride. We discovered that the end of a long pole of some kind was jutting out of the hilly outcrop through the exposed snow, but what it was, we couldn't tell. My father immediately got his trowel out of the shed and proceeded to dig around this large pole, which we thought appeared to be some kind of a marker. And as he dug away large layers of snow and dirt, we found ourselves faced with the most god-awful stench of such that I do not have words in my vocabulary to describe. The undeniable smell of decaying flesh hit our nostrils hard, and whatever we were smelling must have been dead for a while. Suddenly my father's trowel hit a large hairy hand that fell out on the snow in front of us, and I heard him say in horror, "What the heck is this?" He continued to dig until the body of a large hairy monster was revealed. The creature was in the throes of early decomposition, but was still in remarkably good condition, that we could see him clearly, despite having been dead for a long time. The strange, hideous, humanoid-looking thing, whatever it was covered all over its body, from top to bottom, with thick, dark brown hair, apart from its hairless face. The head was an unusual dome shape, and it was literally attached to these humongous rounded shoulders. The face looked like it was weathered and old, because the protruding forehead was filled with deep furrows, and the skin was thickly textured like rhino hide. The dead eyes stared up at us vacantly, and they were a dark brown colour. The nose was so flat and squashed, it rather reminded me of a pug I used to know. And the lips were thin, but when you pushed the lips back, like I did with a piece of twig, I could tell the creature had large teeth that were human-like, only a whole lot bigger than ours. However, the thing that my father and I are in total awe about was the size of this monstrous creature. It was massive and gargantuan, even in death. The creature was giant-like in its proportions, and my father said he was about 9 foot and easily weighed about 1,000 pounds. The creature was solid, stockily built and muscular, with exceedingly long arms and human-like hands and feet, with smooth nail beds. Bear in mind, we had never ever heard of Bigfoot before, but one thing was for certain: this creature looked half human and half ape, and we were certain that it was from the primate family. We found that the whole body was riddled with bullets from top to bottom, as if someone had been using him for target practice. However, it did not take much for us to realize that the previous owner of this property had obviously killed this creature, which may have well terrorized him and his family. We could see that if this creature was alive, it would have been an apex predator and a formidable foe. Maybe this creature was the very reason why the previous owners had gone to such lengths to secure their property and board up their windows. It seemed like a plausible explanation to me. My father was dumbfounded by what we were seeing, because as far as we could see, this creature was not known by science. And my father felt we should notify the authorities about this strange animal that we had found, because he believed we had discovered an unidentified species, and also this formidable looking creature might do some way in going to unravel the mystery of the family that had disappeared from this location so mysteriously. I heard my father on the phone telling the police what we had found, and then we were put through to the police chief himself, which I thought was a bit odd. To cut a long story short, the next thing we knew, a black van drove up our drive about 10 minutes later, and 2 men in black suits got out, and within seconds they placed the dead creature on a gurney and put it in the back of the van, and proceeded to hurry down our drive, even in those treacherous conditions. It all happened so fast that we just went along with the flow and did not ask them any awkward questions as we should have done. Another dark car arrived 5 minutes after that, and 2 men in army suits with large rifles in tow went to investigate the wooded area on our premises, and they did a thorough search. Finally, they seemed satisfied and sped away in the car as fast as they had come. It was all very mysterious, I thought. The following day, my father phoned the police to ask whether the unusual creature we had found had been identified, and we were told it was a misidentification on our parts and that the creature that we found was a bear. My father was furious about being fobbed off like that, because he knew the creature we had seen was definitely not a bear, and I did too. I think there's some weird kind of cover-up going on, he said, and I want to get to the bottom of it. None of this makes any sense to me. I remember my father making some phone calls to find out what was really going on. One day, this very smart-looking black limousine drove up our driveway. I saw my father ushering two formidable men in black suits with dark glasses into our living room. I heard them talk to my father in what seemed like very serious tones. Whatever they said to my father put the fear of God in him, because all the colour had drained from his face, and he never mentioned the huge hairy creature we had seen that freezing day ever again. One day, when I did bring the subject up about the creature we had uncovered on that freezing winter's day, my father told us that we were never to mention the subject again, or even under any circumstances tell anyone about what we had seen and what had transpired. Fast forward to 2018, 4 years after our discovery of the strange hairy creature in our garden. Well, I remember it was a glorious, warm, sunny day, and I was lying on the grassy verge, soaking up the beautiful sun like a hungry sponge. It was such a magnificent day. Suddenly I had this horrible feeling that I was being watched, but as I looked around our garden, I could see nothing. I decided to tuck into my sandwiches, and as I began to eat, I could hear this movement, and then I suddenly saw the creature. She was definitely female, not only because of her breasts, but her feminine energy as well. I was amazed that she was almost identical to the creature we had found buried in the snow 4 years earlier, and I could not help sorrowfully wondering if she was related to it. The creature looked identical to the one we had found, only she was a lot smaller and probably weighed half as much, but she was still very big. I hasten to say that the creature seemed amused by the way I was eating my sandwich and started to mimic me, and she was so funny and a brilliant actress. I stood there staring at her in awe and marvelling at what a magnificent creature she was. She seemed like a very gentle, soft soul. Not once did she threaten me or give me any reason to feel afraid, despite her massive size. After a while, the creature just vanished, like a ghost, but I never forgot what I had seen. And since my encounter, I have thought of her often and really hoped with all my heart that I would see her again. And who knows, maybe in the future I will. I recently learned that this creature I saw was known as a Bigfoot, Sasquatch, or hairy man. And I know he is real. And I do believe that the large male that was killed may have caused some angry big Bigfoot, possibly a relative of his, to take action against the family that shot him. And that may be why they went missing all those years ago. Just a thought. Maybe it was an act of revenge, who knows? Luckily, we've not had any reason to live in fear. And the Bigfoot creature I did encounter was not at all malicious or threatening, I'm glad to say. In fact, the contrary is true. So yes, these creatures are real, and they do exist here in North America. But for some reason, someone does not want us to know that these creatures are real. Who these people are, I have no idea, but there definitely is some kind of cover-up. But I just want to tell you, as someone who has been an eyewitness, that Bigfoot is the real deal. And isn't that a lovely, lovely story? I really, really loved that story. And can you imagine, she was going tobogganing, she was going down a hilly slope in the back of her garden. They had renovated the whole area and put up a new, very modern home. And as she was going tobogganing on a very, very bad winter's day, which if any of you live in that area, you might have remembered that day. And she went tobogganing and she just literally flew off into the lower valley because she knocked this pole. And then they were to discover the body of a dead Bigfoot that had not completely decomposed, so they could see what he was really like. And the strange thing was that when they phoned the authorities came and quickly took him away in a gurney, which is very, very peculiar. It's an extraordinary story, and I've heard stories like this before, so I can't say I'm at all surprised. Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.